Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. I'm Dr. Blunt. Today we're continuing our series Republicanism Explained. We're looking at the third concept of liberty, freedom as non-domination. In the previous episode, which you can watch here, I think, or here, we talked about Isaiah Berlin's famous essay, Two Concepts of Liberty, in which he put out the idea that there are two ways of thinking about freedom, positive freedom and negative freedom. Positive freedom is dangerous. It's about mastering yourself and your base desires, becoming a better person. And the problem is that this leads to being free under totalitarian conditions. Because if you're working with the laws of history or the laws of justice or the laws of like super racism, you can still be free even though you are subjected to the worst forms of oppression. In contrast, he says, there's the idea of negative freedom, which is freedom from something, from interference. And this he associates with modernity, democracy, constitutionalism, capitalism. But there's an issue here. Negative liberty was thought up by Thomas Hobbes, one of the most authoritarian figures in the history of political thought. So why was Hobbes thinking about this modern form of freedom? Well, the answer is that he was engaged in a debate around the English Civil War, in which he was trying to refute this idea that freedom is in fact non-arbitrary interference or freedom from domination. This was put forward by Republicans, who were enemies of Hobbes's patron, the king. But enough history. Let's look at contemporary thought about this third concept of liberty, freedom as non-domination. Now, apart from Quentin Skinner, who I mentioned in the previous episode, the person most associated with the revival of republicanism is Philip Pettit. In 1997, Pettit published a book called Republicanism, A Theory of Freedom and Government, in which he put out the extremely compelling thesis that republicanism has a distinct concept of liberty that is not freedom as self-mastery, but is neither freedom as non-interference. Instead, it is freedom as non-domination, a negative idea of freedom, but not the same as the one Berlin and Hobbes supported. What do we mean when we talk about freedom from domination? Well, I usually start with a basic definition of domination. It goes something like this. A social relationship is dominating if X, an agent, possesses the power to arbitrarily interfere in the choices available to Y, a dependent subject. Now, there's a lot of information squished into that little sentence, but we can unpack it into 4 clauses. Clause number 1. We're talking about social relationships. So we're not talking about freedom in a sort of physicist sense of like chucking a rock through space and it doesn't stop until it hits something, right? Newtonian physics. That's not our jam. We're talking about social freedom. And when I mean social relationships, I'm talking about it in a Weberian sense. The idea that we are mutually dependent on each other to achieve our aims. So X wants to do something, but they need Y. And Y wants to do something, but they need X. And we're all caught on this. You know, Simon and Garfunkel were wrong. No man is a rock. No man is an island. And that was the implication of their song. You're just a sad boy in 1960s New York. Weird diversion, but whatever. Clause number 2 is that power in this relationship is asymmetrically divided. X has more power than Y. But the third clause is that this is not a trivial division. We're not talking about like little differences of power. We're talking about big differences of power, sufficient to produce dependency in Y. Now, what do I mean by dependency? I mean that the cost of exiting the social relationship is so high as to be unreasonable. And when we think about domination, we often think that dominated agents are so oppressed that they can't actually do anything. But that's not true. You know, if you look at the history of dominated people, people who lack freedom, they often rebel, they often revolt, they often break the rules, but they do so in small numbers or subtly, and they do so knowing that there is a huge risk at getting busted. And that's what I mean when we talk about dependency. This leads to the fourth, final, and most important clause. The exercise of this asymmetric power is arbitrary. Now this is, go back to the Latin root, right? Arbitrium. It's about judgment. It means that the exercise of power rests solely on the judgment of X, of that powerful agent. The weaker agent can't check the use of power. They are completely vulnerable to its exercise. They are not in control of this relationship. So those are our four clauses. What do they mean? Well, we're going to be fancy. I'm going to say that there are four theorems that we can derive from this simple definition of domination. The first theorem about domination is that it can manifest through direct interference. And this makes sense. Think about slavery, which is the archetypical example of domination in the centuries and millennia of writing about republicanism. The ancient republicans, they often contrasted the slave as the antithesis of the free man. And it sort of blows my mind because Rome was a slave-owning society, right? But they were completely just like, yeah, it's fine. Sometimes people are slaves. Freedom doesn't need to apply to every person. It only needs to apply to Romans. And once a year, we'll have the Saturnalia where everything gets reversed. It's such a weird festival. The Saturnalia, Roman history diversion, was when the citizens became the slaves and the slaves became citizens for one day, and masters had to serve their slaves and slaves had to pretend that they were masters, and everyone got really, really loaded and had a good time. It was sort of a social release valve for tension in society. So long as there was Saturnalia, there probably wasn't going to be a slave uprising, or the chances of a slave uprising were significantly lower. Rome's crazy, guys. Sometimes I read about Roman history and I just think to myself, that seems almost impossible. But hey, people will one day look back at our society and think, these people gave away a lot of their data to the internet for no good reason. So hey, what can we do? The second theorem is really interesting. It says that domination doesn't actually need to directly interfere with you to limit your liberty. Now, what do we mean by this? Well, think again about slavery. Now, let's say you're a slave, but your master happens to be pretty chill. He's a lazy guy. He just spends all day in bed smoking weed and generally leaves you alone. Are you free? Now, if I'm a Hobbesian and I think that freedom is non-interference, I'm going to say, yeah, master's upstairs, smoking weed, watching YouTube, and I can just go out and do whatever I want. I'm not being interfered with, therefore I am free. Much like the subject of the absolute monarch who doesn't interfere with the choices of their subjects, they are free, according to Hobbes. But a Republican can say, no, you're not. No, you're not. Because even though you're not being interfered with, you are still subject to the power of interference. The fact that your master's upstairs smoking weed in bed doesn't mean that one day he's not going to get out of bed and absolutely tyrannize you. You are under his power. You don't have free choice. You have choice with that big asterisk on it. You might say, I'm going to go to the supermarket and get some shopping, but there's that asterisk, if my master says I can. Everything you do has that asterisk on it. Your free choice doesn't actually exist. You're always going to be aware that someone else has the power to say no to you, and you can do nothing about it. That makes you less free. The third theorem is about non-dominating interference. This can exist, but it doesn't limit your liberty. Now, we're going to talk about this more extensively when we get into Republican political philosophy, but they'll say a citizen of a free state may be interfered with by the law. I might not be able to drive at 100 kilometers an hour down my street, but that doesn't make me less free. Why? Because the law is subject to non-arbitrary application, so it applies to everyone equally. It's generated by representatives of the people, and it is enforced by an executive in a way that is accountable, perhaps to the judiciary, right? These checks on the use of power make that interference non-dominating, and therefore your liberty doesn't shrink. Now, this is a point where a libertarian might be like, are you all right, man? Because you can have a whole lot of choices taken away by this non-arbitrary interference. Surely you'd be less free. Well, that's one of the big puzzles that we're going to be looking at in the future, and it's a significant challenge to republicanism. But we're going to put a little pin in that and move on to the next theorem. Non-domination can exist without actual interference. in your choices. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, let's say you're a convinced libertarian and you decide to watch a video on YouTube about republicanism, and the presenter is, so engaging and charismatic and handsome that you're just like, you know what? Freedom as non-domination, that's my jam. Freedom as non-interference, that's tired and busted. I've seen the light. I'm changing my political orientation. Now, why isn't this interference in a problematic way? Well, because the choice of being a libertarian still exists for you. Oh, have I let the cat out of the bag? I'm talking about this video. No, look, if you decide that you are convinced by republicanism over libertarianism or fascism or whatever, the option to do those other things still exists, right? No option has been removed from you. We've simply engaged in this thing called dialogue, in which you've been convinced to come around to a different way of thinking. Okay, now we know what freedom from domination means. It means that you are not subjected to arbitrary interference. But we're just getting started, baby, because republicanism is, as Pettit's subtitle tells us, a theory of freedom and government. So what does the idea of non-domination mean when we look at politics or international relations or society at large? What does non-domination mean in the workplace, for example? These are interesting topics, and they're going to be the subject of subsequent videos. Thanks for watching. Take care, everyone.